everybody. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Today's case is the notorious case of 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez, and sadly, it contains extensive, brutal child harm and an entire system failing him. Ultimately, this led to his demise.
An emergency.
Yes, I would like to, my son is not breathing.
Your son is what?
He's not breathing.
Hold on 1 second. I'm going to transfer you over to the fire department. Don't hang up.
My son is 8 years old.
It's your son, okay. And
Yes.
he's not breathing?
No.
Is he having a seizure?
No, he was wrestling with my other son, and I came in and he just was unconscious.
Okay, do you have the paramedics on the way right now? Are you right there with him?
Yes, I'm right here.
Okay, do you know how to do CPR?
I'm just doing the compulsions on the chest right now.
Okay,
and
you
I
need
should
to
be
breathe for him. If he's not breathing, you need to do 2 breaths and 30 compressions. Just need you to keep doing that until the paramedics come, okay? They're on their way. They're coming as fast as they can.
We're going to jump straight into the case using our nursing SBAR format, but be sure to check the description box down below if you're not familiar with what that means. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below any case suggestions that you have so that you can get a shout out. June, thank you so much for today's recommendation. April 26, 2013 was a sunny California day. Palmdale, California is a city just north of Los Angeles where today's story takes place. Pearl Martinez went to the Department of Social Services office in Palmdale, California, bringing along her 3 children to request government assistance. But one little boy stood out, and not for good reason. A security guard working in the building by the name of Arturo Martinez called 911 after noticing that one of Pearl's children was covered in cigarette burns. Arturo said while testifying, "I saw him sad, full of bruises with cigarette burns on the back of his head, neck, and cuts and scratches," and then explained that he saw somewhere between 17 to 23 burns behind his ears, on the back of his neck, and had purple and greenish marks all over him. Now, something that's taught in nursing is actually how to look for signs of abuse while assessing someone, and what Arturo saw is exactly one of those red flags: wounds or bruises in various stages of healing. Bruising typically starts off a reddish purple color and then moves on to dark purple, then progresses to a lighter color with green, yellow, and red hues, sometimes even brown. Seeing different wounds in random areas, all at different colors and stages, is immediately concerning because that indicates that this is not a one-time incident that can be explained away logically. Now, typically, as mandated reporters, you try to gather as much information as possible when this is witnessed so that you can report it, just like Arturo did. Want to know what the 911 operator said to Arturo when he called after seeing the little boy? That is not an emergency, and to call the non-emergent number. This call took place 2 weeks before Gabriel was murdered. Had the police treated this call with the same urgency and attentiveness that Arturo did, maybe he would still be here. Despite the security guard's cry for help 2 weeks prior, on May 22, 2013, Pearl Fernandez called 911 and stated that Gabriel, her 8-year-old son, was not breathing and was unresponsive. She sounded calm. You heard the clip at the beginning of the video. Did she sound sincerely concerned to you? Then Isaro Tony Aguirre, Pearl's boyfriend, spoke with dispatch and said, "My son isn't breathing. He was wrestling with our other son, and now he's unconscious." On the call, he said he was doing CPR with the guidance of the dispatcher. Now, if you recall what we heard, it didn't sound to me like he was doing anything more than talking on the phone. CPR, like we've actually discussed in prior cases, is exhausting, even on a child. He did not sound panicked, breathless, or as if he was physically doing anything, in my opinion. During the trial, it was noted by the police that there was no blood on Isaro or Pearl, which would have indicated that they had attempted to give Gabriel CPR. The first responders on scene were in total shock at what they saw, but they had to remain calm and focused to stabilize Gabriel to transfer him to the hospital. I cannot imagine how tough it must have been to do that. Isato and Pearl were separated to be interviewed by the police, and neither adult was concerned enough to care about going in the ambulance to be with Gabriel as he headed to the hospital. That night, Antelope Valley Hospital emergency room was interrupted by the alarms and overhead calls saying code green, pediatric. Code greens at most hospitals mean that there's a patient rushing in, actively receiving CPR to save their life. The reason that this is called overhead at the facility and not just locally within the emergency room is actually because all the resources in the building pull together from different departments and they rush to the trauma bay for the moment that that patient arrives to take over care. The team typically contains everyone you can think of, from trauma nurses, anesthesia, ER doctors, surgeons, social work, labs, and respiratory therapy. Christine is the registered nurse that cared for Gabriel that day. Her story and the Netflix documentary was incredibly hard to listen to as a nurse. We all have had that one patient in our career that forever changed us, and Gabriel was hers. The paramedics called in to give a brief report en route and said that the little boy was 8 years old, coding, and per Pearl had slipped in the tub, but that story wasn't adding up. Gabriel's pulse did come back while in the ambulance along the way, and the code team was very relieved to hear this, but pulses coming back means that the patient's heart is beating on its own again, so the hope is that they're going to stabilize and recover. However, in this case, this was just the beginning. The moment that Gabriel was transferred to the code team's care at 11:27 p.m. in the trauma bay, his heart stopped beating once again. The team swarmed and immediately started hooking Gabriel up to the equipment, ventilating him, getting his vital signs and lab work drawn, getting emergency medications prepared and given. They continued CPR, and then they got orders placed to see what was going on. What could have happened to this little boy to get him here? The reason that the doctors will place orders during these critical times is because the sooner you find out the root cause of what's going on, the sooner you can treat it, and hopefully you can save their life. Every single second matters during this time. They got Gabriel's heart beating again, so he was rushed to imaging to look for more answers. The code team stood by while he was testing because of how unstable he was, and thankfully they did, because his heart stopped beating again. And this was seen and confirmed on the monitors. They rushed Gabriel back to the room to continue working on him while the hospital worked to arrange his transfer to a higher level of care over to LA Children's Hospital. Now, during a code, everybody has assigned roles or jobs. Christine's was documenting, and when you're the nurse in charge of charting the code, that includes medication administration times, head-to-toe assessments, and anything else necessary. Per the emergency record, Gabriel was in full arrest. This meant that his heart was not beating and was actively requiring CPR upon arrival, sadly. It was also documented that he had a depressed skull fracture, and imaging showed a subdural hematoma with crepitus on assessment. This means that there's a fluid collection of blood on the brain, both acute and traumatic. Crepitus is a feeling paired with a sound on assessment described to be similar to Rice Krispies, and it's very concerning in this setting. It indicates severe trauma to the underlying tissues. Christine continued to document that there was diffuse soft tissue swelling of the brain that was also noted on imaging, further indicating severe levels of trauma to the brain. The skin was missing on his throat and appeared as if someone had burned him many times. He had cuts and injuries all over the trunk of his body. Gabriel's face was covered in cuts and bruises. Both of his eyes were black, as if he'd been punched repeatedly. He had a laceration or cut above the groin area. There were scrapes across both of the tops of his little feet that indicated that he had been dragged, likely on the carpet, and his feet were swollen because of it. There were also marks that looked to the team to be ligature marks or areas that he had been bound by at the ankles. Imaging showed that he had BB bullets in his lungs and in his groin. Cigarette marks were found all over his body, and also he had jagged and missing teeth. Christine described the aftermath of this code perfectly in the documentary, and I can definitely echo this feeling. There are tubes, packages, sheets, bodily fluids, and chaos everywhere because you're all doing everything that you can, exerting every ounce of effort that you have to save someone's life in those moments. Nobody wants to waste a millisecond carefully opening anything when time matters this much, especially for a child. You rip the bag open and you get him the medications now because it could be the difference between him living or not. All this whirlwind happens, and then the adrenaline slows down, and you're left with the feeling of overwhelm. Did you do enough? How could anyone harm a child in this way? This part really made me emotional because I understand it so well. After coding him several times, the LA Children's team arrived to transfer him to a higher level of care. Despite this transfer, Gabriel continued to code, and upon further testing, was found to have no brain activity. Gabriel was pronounced dead May 24, 2013 at 2:52 p.m. Gabriel Daniel Fernandez was a sweet 8-year-old boy that was born on February 20, 2005 to Arnold Contreras and Pearl Fernandez. He was raised initially by his great-uncles, Michael Carranza and his partner David Martinez. They described him as playful, loving, and helpful to everyone. From a very young age, Gabriel was consistently worried about and asking about his mom. It's reported by Pearl's entire family that she did not want Gabriel. After being left in the hospital for 3 days, Pearl's uncle and his partner went to go get him and begged to keep him. Gabriel truly was the light of Michael and David's life, and they loved every moment of taking care of him. When you see the pictures of Gabriel as a baby, you can see a resilient, happy, healthy little boy when they were with him. After a couple of years, though, Gabriel's grandparents said a same-gender couple should not be raising him and asked for custody. They didn't put it as politely as I worded it, but use your imagination. Rumors were spread by the grandparents that David and Michael SA'd Gabriel, if you know what I mean. Pearl and her parents were known to be homophobic, but this claim that David and Michael harmed him was never founded by anybody. Pearl's own siblings and everyone else around said that they did not believe that at all. Sandra and Robert Fernandez then took custody of Gabriel from Michael and David. Gabriel seemed happy at his grandparents overall, but also worked to have a relationship built with his mother during this time. About 6 to 8 months before his passing, he went to stay with his mother in Isaro. Gabriel has 2 siblings, Ezekiel and Virginia, and all 3 have the same parents. There are no reports of the other 2 children being harmed by Pearl. Pearl started collecting welfare money once she got all 3 kids back, and that's a theory that was actually mentioned during the trial as to why this monster even wanted them around after all these years. Despite being a significant part of Gabriel's life and arguably one of the only happy and safe times in his life, David and Michael were not allowed to say goodbye when he was pulled off of life support by Sandra and Robert Fernandez. This really broke the both of them. I cannot imagine being able to sit and writhe in your grief and not say goodbye to someone that you cared for. An ex that Pearl dated while pregnant with Gabriel said that she was crying, broken, and lost when she found out that she was pregnant. Pearl did not want Gabriel, and that's why she left him at the hospital. She used alcohol and hard drugs starting from the age of 9 and was always a troubled child, teenager, and adult. Pearl told the psychiatrist during an evaluation that there was an attempted R word by her uncle and also had been a victim of gang R word. She reports violence and harm by her parents as well, and this is something that her attorneys used in the trial to attempt to excuse her behavior and lack of maternal instincts towards her own son. Interesting, though, given the fact that she had plenty of maternal instincts towards her other 2 children and her cats, just not for Gabriel. That excuse isn't welcomed here. Pearl's family said that she always dressed provocatively and she was never the victim in her relationship. Oftentimes, she was violent towards Isato. Many witnesses said that she would hit him and scratch him in front of other people, regardless of who was around. She was given an intellectual disability hearing to ensure that she was fit to stand trial. And in that, her neurocognitive eval stated that Pearl is developmentally delayed across the board, both emotionally and intellectually. The doctor also diagnosed her with PTSD and possible personality disorders. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, and this usually involves anxiety, panic, and flashbacks from traumatic life events. Pearl also had an MRI of the brain that showed abnormalities in the frontal and parietal lobes. Abnormalities in these areas of the brain are very telling. The frontal lobe is responsible for memories, thinking, reasoning, and self-control. The parietal lobe is responsible for senses, cognition, and speech. Having changes on imaging in these portions of the brain just confirms that it could mean that any of these abilities can be altered, potentially from trauma or her chronic drug and alcohol use throughout her development. Pearl met Isato and began dating him a couple years before Gabriel's death while he was working as a security guard. The prosecution did an excellent job at painting the picture of the power dynamic and size dynamic between Isato and Gabriel during the trial. Isato, the man that took pleasure in harming a small, innocent little boy, towered over Gabriel at 6'2", 270 pounds, and was 32 years old at the time of his crime. Gabriel was 4'1" and 7 at that time. According to Pearl's sister, he seemed like a good guy, and the family hoped that he would be a good influence on her, but clearly that's not what happened. Detective Elliott interviewed Isato. He told the detective that he was angry with Gabriel because Gabriel asked his mom, "Mom, why are you with him if he's always hurting me? If you leave him, I will start being good." Isato then goes on to say that he told Gabriel to confront him, a grown man, and to say it to his face rather than his mom. He admits to spanking him at this time, and then went into a blind rage over Gabriel denying that he had spoke badly of Isato to his mother. This was the reason that he brutally attacked Gabriel. Before we move on to our assessment portion, we need to talk about an additional way that this child was failed. The entire legal system let Gabriel down. LA County Board of Supervisors met, and they discussed Gabriel's case on 5/28 after the LA Times released an article about Gabriel. At this meeting, it was noted that Gabriel was under Department of Children and Family Services care, or DCFS restriction, at the time of his passing. Now, the board manages and funds the hospitals, the sheriff's department, DA's office, fire department, and DCFS, so they're powerful. You could imagine how problematic it would probably be to them that this was in the news. And we're never going to know if that's because Gabriel was actually let down by the system or if they were just wanting to protect themselves. Now, in a private interview between Garrett and the LA Times, there was an anonymous employee that was working for the board that revealed that the LA County Board had been aware of and received reports of what happened to Gabriel. The LA Board was aware that Pearl had shot Gabriel with a BB gun in the face. They were aware that repeated beatings had happened, that Gabriel was seen with clear and visible traumatic injuries, including teeth having been ripped out, inconsistent with dentist's work, meaning that he had been brutally harmed in the removal process of his teeth. There were 9 separate incidents where they had to check on Gabriel between 2003 and 2012, all including severe neglect, physical violence, emotional neglect, and general neglect. This private conversation propelled the story to the front and center on the LA Times newspaper, despite how it would look against the city's most powerful entity. Now we're going to go over some of the examples, aside from the obvious, of when Gabriel was completely abandoned by the system. These were safety nets that were supposed to be in place that were clearly missed. An in-home therapist saw the notes from Gabriel that said, "I love you so much, I will delete myself." This was 87 days before he passed away. Pearl told the social worker that it was for attention because he just wanted to go back to live with his grandparents. Now, why wouldn't the social worker dig a little deeper as to why a small child said that? DCFS spoke with Pearl about this incident as opposed to talking to Gabriel. The prosecutor pointed out that Pearl never tried to help Gabriel before, so showing this to a social worker voluntarily was an attempt to set up her own story for later. Pearl's own sister, Melissa, testified that in the trial against Isaro, that one time Gabriel came over with a black eye and his teeth were missing. Gabriel said that the black eye came from playing with his brother, and then later confessed to his Aunt Melissa that it was actually his mom that punched him in the eye. This was one of many instances that he admitted getting black eyes from her. She reported this, and then nothing was done. Gabriel's first grade teacher, Jennifer Garcia, testified at the trial and said that Gabriel had said, "Is it normal for your parents to hit you with a belt until you bleed?" The teacher called DCFS hotline immediately. Stephanie Rodriguez called her the next day. She was an emergency caseworker and was new to the job. On another occasion, Gabriel admitted to being punched in the mouth, and the principal was there as a witness, but the teacher was encouraged to simply report it and do her job, despite feeling compelled to do more. Per his teacher, Jennifer, Gabriel then withdrew from everything emotionally and did not want to go out and play anymore. This is a textbook sign of depression and often gets overlooked in children because we assume that only adults can be depressed. He would stay in during recess and help his teacher instead of going outside and playing with his friends. Gabriel also admitted to Jennifer that he was shot with a BB gun because DCFS came, and each visit made the attack significantly worse than the prior. This absolutely broke her heart to know that Pearl was retaliating against Gabriel because of Jennifer's phone calls, but after hearing this, she had to report it once again. Gabriel was then absent for a period of time, and Jennifer was very worried that he had been retaliated against even worse than he was before. Gabriel came back to school looking burned with a red, bloodshot eye. He said that he fell when she asked him what happened this time. His injuries can be seen in the picture where he's holding up the letter O for Mother's Day. Jennifer called DCFS again and left a message and did not receive a call back from the caseworker Stephanie this time. Despite all the injuries and trauma, on Mother's Day, Gabriel still was excited to make Pearl a gift. He described her as a loving mom and wrote that she's beautiful. This was 2 weeks before he was beaten for the last time. Pearl didn't deserve to know the unconditional love of a child. These 4 social workers were charged for the knowledge that they had and failure to act, which resulted in Gabriel's death. Although a motion to dismiss was placed by their legal representation, Judge Lamelli decided to deny the motion and move forward to trial because, quote, "These DCFS staff members' actions represented an improper regard for the child's life and failure at every level." Stephanie Rodriguez, Patricia Clement, Kevin Baum, and Greg Merritt were all charged for felony child abuse and falsified public records in relation to torture and the death of the child. Jackie Lacey, the DA, was quoted saying, "We believe these social workers were criminally negligent and performed their legal duties with willful disregard for Gabriel's well-being. They should be held responsible for their actions." Greg Merritt is a former DCFS supervisor with over 23 years of experience. He had been working in that role for over a decade, managing 6 social workers who had about 30 to 4 cases each, meaning he was essentially responsible for 180 to 240 cases. Per Merritt, the department is beyond overstretched and said that he was unable to keep a pulse on every case that they were tasked. Now, removing children from the home should be the absolute last move to make because of how traumatic it is for the child and for the family. California particularly emphasizes the importance of doing everything possible not to remove the child from the home. In my opinion, this is to a fault. Per Greg, DCFS specialized in family preservation and unification, not tearing families apart. But would we categorize what Gabriel was experiencing family? I wouldn't. According to Patricia Clement, a DCFS social worker, Gabriel was acting up in school and was angry and disrespectful to his teacher per his mom, Pearl. But did she actually talk to Gabriel or ever assess him like she was supposed to? No. Not only did she not check on him, but she also never fact-checked anything that Pearl said, nor did she discuss any of this with the teacher at the school, who was the one who made the report. This is another example of a safety net failing this child. He was never assessed if there was anything ongoing regarding physical violence, despite Miss Garcia's persistence in trying to protect him. She never laid eyes on him and never did the required physical assessment paperwork. Pat Clement was a nun for 10 years, but all the staff that ever worked with her had described her as tough, vulgar, and not easy to work with. Per Pat, Gabriel's case was about neglect, not violence, and she said that nobody mentioned a word of abuse to her at her visit. But, of course, Pearl wouldn't. That's what the experts are there for. They're supposed to assess that. She also said that she never saw bruises because she, once again, never physically assessed or met him. Greg Merritt signed off on Pat's review of this case. Pat backdated the case so that she wouldn't have been held liable or seen as responsible in the eyes of the court. Now, this was a month before his death. This is where the falsifying documentation charge came in. Stephanie never talked to the grandparents and took everything that Pearl said also at face value, even recognizing and categorizing all the incidents as accidents. She never completed a body assessment on Gabriel either. Pearl had a story for everything, and this checks out because she's a master manipulator. Now, Kevin Baum was Stephanie's boss and signed off on her care because she was so new in her position. He was very lax with managing her and approved of her documentation without thoroughly reviewing it, admittedly. Had he done his job as her leader, maybe Gabriel wouldn't have slipped through the cracks. Another DCFS worker said that she saw the bruises and BB marks on him and never made a body chart. Another case of falsifying documentation. She documented that the risk level was diminishing and that Isaro was a great guy, but once again did not thoroughly assess Gabriel while he was sitting locked in a cupboard. The charges against all 4 social workers were dismissed by the appeals court despite Judge Lomelli's charges for child abuse and falsifying documentation. Let me know your thoughts on this because I personally feel very conflicted about it. They definitely played a huge role in this case. It was also discovered that during the legal proceedings, there was an internal investigation going on in the police department, secondary to the internal investigation occurring within the DCFS. The prosecution had to fight hard to get that information turned over by the police. Officer Federico Gonzalez was sent to the home after that initial therapist saw that self-deleting note, if you recall from earlier. The officer showed up at 2 o'clock in the morning, but never laid eyes on the child. He spoke with Pearl. He decided, based on what he was told, that Gabriel was spoiled and would come back the next day to scare him into behaving. He was put in the back of a cop car, and Officer Gonzalez said that he would go to jail if he continued lying per Pearl's sister. On an additional follow-up, Pearl told the officer that Gabriel had been moved to Texas, so he wouldn't be able to check on him really. So, we find out later on that he was actually gagged and locked in the cupboard during that time. This was a week before his life was taken. If DCFS is being fired and charged, what about these negligent police officers? There were reportedly several times that officers went out to check on Gabriel with no reports filed, per Pearl's family. The Deputy DA, Scott Young, and Jonathan Hatami were both the prosecutors that were representing the people on behalf of Gabriel Fernandez in the trial against Pearl Fernandez and Isaro Aguirre. Arnold Contreras, all 3 children's biological father, was released from prison and reached out to the DA's office prior to the trial. He was notified of Gabriel's death while in jail in Riverside, and he was completely distraught by the loss of his son. He testified in the trial against Pearl and Isato and apologized for not being there more for his son. The first responders that showed up that night of the 911 call testified as witnesses in the trial as well. Gabriel was found on the floor, face up, in severe distress and not breathing. The team started CPR in the living room, giving epinephrine, CPR, and ventilations. This means that they were doing chest compressions, had an AED on his chest, and they were giving him breaths and rounds of medication to attempt to restart his heart. Firefighters were emotional, and on the stand, they said that they would never forget this call, and I don't think that anyone that's ever heard of this case will ever forget it, even though none of us were physically there. So imagine actually being in their position. All of the first responders noticed the trauma on his body while doing CPR and said that it was impossible to miss. They noted that there were abrasions all over his face. His ankles were swollen, and he had squeeze marks, bite marks, bruises, and depressed skull fracture, had holes like BB gun shot marks on him, and one of the officers even said, the more that you looked, the more that you saw, and it was truly unbelievable the amount of damage inflicted on this child. The battalion chief stated that Pearl and Isato did not have any logic to their excuses. They were nervous, standoffish, and argumentative, and their actions were clearly inconsistent with someone that cares about their child. Pearl asked about her daughter and her other son, but had no questions about Gabriel while he was being whisked away to the hospital. She also expressed concern about her 5 cats and did not want them alone in their cage. Meanwhile, her son was alone in the back of an ambulance. Pearl proceeded to tell investigators that Gabriel is a liar, and no matter what he said, he's lying to you. She also mentioned that he's gay. Even if that were true, what difference would that have made on the value of his life? One of the first things that Isato said to emergency responders was that Gabriel's gay. One of the officers also found all of his clothes, and they were in bags under the sink, and they intentionally left out 2 girl dresses for him to wear. Gabriel was known to be a soft, sweet boy, and obviously was raised for some time by Pearl's uncle and his partner, but is that why she was resentful? Because they raised him? Was she just being vile and homophobic like her parents? While beating him in his final moments, both Pearl and Isato were yelling at Gabriel and calling him gay. As far as evidence goes, like I mentioned earlier, it didn't appear that Pearl or Isato ever tried to save Gabriel's life, and the fire department testified of that. Police found blood that had been washed down the sink after attempting to clean Gabriel up prior to the paramedics' arrival to cover themselves. Something that stood out to the investigators as acutely out of place, though, at the crime scene was a cupboard at the end of the bed. Gabriel spent most of his time in this small, dark place. His siblings snuck him food through the small cracks between the doors whenever possible, which obviously was difficult to do with Pearl around as much. But Gabriel not only slept in this cupboard, he was also handcuffed at the ankles, had socks shoved in his mouth, and then had a bandana tied over his face and was typically in here when the social workers came to check on him. This was the life that this precious boy knew for 8 months while staying with his mother. Gabriel's autopsy showed multiple bilateral rib fractures per the forensic radiologist, Dr. Donald Boger. All of the injuries were differently timed fractures. Similar to the bruises that we talked about earlier being in different phases, you can tell on imaging whether a fracture is new, healing, or healed, so this would tell the doctor that Gabriel had been attacked to the point of broken ribs on more than one occasion, and on both sides. Fractures are painful, and it's not because of the bone itself, but the nerves outside and around it, depending on the location of the broken rib. It can apply pressure to and cause injuries to everything around it. I'm not sure if anyone watching has actually had a broken rib before, but I have cared for patients after coding with broken ribs, as well as car accident patients, and all of them have said that the rib fractures were one of the most painful injuries that they've had. To know that Gabriel lived with these fractures many times without any medical attention is sick. It took 2 days to document all of Gabriel's injuries during the autopsy due to the sheer volume of them. Something equally upsetting, though, was that the doctor found that his thymus gland was nearly non-existent, which meant that he was undergoing prolonged stress, both physical and emotional, for an extended period of time. In healthy children, this gland should be plump and easily identifiable. He also had a subdural hematoma, which was caused by a wooden club found by the investigators at the crime scene, and the DNA found on the bat was matched to Gabriel. The doctor was asked what the cause of death was for Gabriel Fernandez, and he determined that it was caused by a sequelae of blunt force trauma and child neglect. Sequelae means what transpires from or causes a chain of events. So what he's saying is that Gabriel had a traumatic injury and then was neglected afterwards, which ultimately led to his passing. His stomach was also examined and was filled with what the doctor felt was sand. The investigators examined what it was, and tests were performed that confirmed that it was cat litter that he had been force-fed. He was eating litter while the cats were eating food. Pearl cared more about the cats than she did her own child. It was confirmed that the manner of death was homicide. Ezekiel and Virginia both testified as witnesses in the trial, and they provided the most powerful testimony of all of them. They witnessed the last beating of Gabriel that ended his life. Ezekiel testified that he saw Isauro pick Gabriel up by his throat and choke him against the wall with his small feet dangling. Virginia stated that Gabriel would scrape the litter, and when he didn't clean it to Isauro and Pearl's standards, Isauro force-fed him the litter. Ezekiel stated that Gabriel would be in the box a lot, referring to the small cupboard. There were 2 beds in the siblings' room, though. Gabriel still slept in the box day and night despite having a bed. The kids said that they would lock him in there with his handcuffs on the outside. They put a bandana around his mouth and sometimes socks down his throat to keep him quiet when social workers arrived. Though there was a bottle in there, he would often soil himself inside the box. The kids would sneak him a banana in there, but Gabriel oftentimes went hungry. The children witnessed his teeth getting knocked out by Pearl using the bat, at least the bottom of it, and they never brought him in for medical care. They pepper sprayed him while he was in the bathtub using Isauro's work-issued pepper spray. While they did this, he cried and tried to escape the bathroom, but they would not let him out. Both of them called him gay frequently and made him dress like a girl. They put makeup on his bruises and tried ice baths to help heal the bruises quicker, and then they would immediately put him back in the cupboard. That fateful night, Pearl, Gabriel, and Virginia were in Virginia's room, and Gabriel was playing with toys. Pearl hit him in the face and then dragged him to her room for playing with his sibling and her toys. Virginia heard screaming and a lot of banging and confirmed hearing Aguirre called Gabriel gay. Isauro admitted that he hit him about 20 times in the body and 10 times in the head. Afterwards, Pearl told Virginia to say that he was playing with her and that's how he hit his head. So many different versions of this story had been told by Pearl at this point. Per Pearl's and Isauro's account, Pearl was on the edge of the bed and Isauro was punching and kicking him until he fell and knocked the wind out of him. They threw him in the shower and yelled at him to wake up, and when he didn't, Pearl called the police. They cleaned up the blood on the floor and made Virginia help as well. Isauro sat without any emotion during this. Initially, Pearl and Isauro were charged together, but Pearl yelled at Isauro every time they were in court, so their trials were separated. A recording setup was placed in the holding cells at the courthouse, and the audio was presented in the trial. While in the cell, she was shouting and asking Isauro if he told them that it was an accident and wanted to straighten out their story. She continued yelling, "They don't know about the torture part." Then the conversation took a sexual, bizarre turn. The mutual violence towards Gabriel was arousing to them. This was confirmed via the wire in the cells and text messages between them in the past. John Allen represented Isato Aguirre. He pled guilty to his crimes and said that he was completely out of control and could not stop hitting Gabriel, and there is no excuse for what he did. He was hoping to be convicted of second-degree murder due to his blind rage. Please. The prosecutors were arguing for first degree with special circumstances of torture, and this would actually make him able to receive the death penalty. The criteria to make it a special circumstance for first degree was that it needed to be willful, deliberate, and premeditated. After jury deliberations, he was in fact convicted of first-degree murder and received the death penalty. He is at San Quentin Prison. Less than 1% of cases in California actually qualify for the death penalty. Now, Pearl's team knew of Isato's conviction, and this changed the course of their plan. Pearl pled guilty and entered a plea deal, receiving a life sentence without parole, and was convicted of first-degree murder. 4 months later, Pearl and Isato were before a judge for sentencing, and the judge's final remarks were moving. At this time, impact statements were made. His teacher, Jennifer Garcia, spoke, and she shared that Gabriel's number in class was 28, and that she has never and will never reassign it to another student to honor him. What she shared about her time with him was that he was very loving and a very, very sweet kid. Isato chose to remain silent, but of course, Pearl made a statement, and she said that she was sorry for what she did to her family and wishes that Gabriel was still alive. She then went on to apologize to her children and ask for forgiveness, but also said that she hopes that the others come to their senses and come around. Come to their senses? I have no words, but I'm going to attach the clip of Judge Lomelli's remarks during the sentencing because I think that he actually captures how many of us feel after diving into this case.
The conduct was horrendous, inhumane, and nothing short of evil. The repeated beatings, burning, starving, binding, shooting Gabriel with BBs that were embedded in different parts of his body, knocking his teeth out with a bat, locking him in a dark cabinet while he's bound, and starving this poor child. It is unimaginable the pain that this child probably endured. And from what I heard, Gabriel was a kind, loving individual who just wanted to be loved. And so, you want to say that the conduct was animalistic, but that would be wrong. Because even animals know how to take care of their young, some to an extent that they will sacrifice their own lives in caring for their young. I remember saying years ago a report on the news that and this at least sent the point home to me about animals, and there was this cat who had given birth to a litter of cats, and the house wherein the kittens were in was on fire. And that's what I think it made the news, because the fire department was trying to put the fire out, but each time the mother went in to retrieve a kitten, and she would emerge from the house by the scruff, holding the kitten by the scruff, and would manage one by one to bring him or her to safety. And the last time, the house was lost, and the fire department tried to keep this cat from going into the house, but it managed to elude them, went into the house, and they thought, well, she's lost. And I never forgot thinking she made it out of the house. She had the cat by the scruff, except that she was singed and burning her face. But the thing that really struck me was the cat was not blind. The intensity of the heat burned her eyes, but she never let go of that kitten. And so when you want to say, first instinct is to say, you know what, this is animalistic. No, it's beyond animalistic, because animals know how to take care of their young. You know, I can only wish, I really do, that you both, in the middle of the night, you wake up and you think of the injuries that you subjected this poor young man, this poor 7-year-old, and that it tortures you. I rarely say that. I rarely say that. It'll be a different type of torture, because you won't be in pain, physical pain. But I'm not sure that you're capable of doing that. But that's my wish.
I think that Lomelli hit it on the head when he said that Pearl and Isato are pure evil, and that she doesn't even have an animalistic behavior because they do care for their own. Gabriel Fernandez was beaten and harmed far more than he ever felt love. And somehow, this never changed his spirit or his heart. This angel didn't have toys, and he stood by while his siblings did. He was not allowed to play. His view was limited to that of a sliver in between the cracks of a cupboard. There's a tree that's often adorned with candles and balloons and bears to this day that remains near the apartment that he was brutally beaten to death. A symbol of love from the community that he was never shown by his own mother or her partner. There were over 1,200 exhibits in this trial, 1,200 examples of the pain, torture, and violence that this boy received. Pearl and Isato were evil, homophobic monsters, and they projected that onto an innocent child. No words will ever capture the feelings that we all have about this story, but sharing it is important because he deserves justice. Gabriel Fernandez deserves to be remembered, and I know that he would want the world to know the signs to watch out for in order to hopefully prevent this so that other children don't suffer like he did. Rest in peace, sweet boy. You will never be forgotten. Thank you all so much for being here, and please, please take good care of yourselves. Nurse's orders. Bye.